Ever since a certain Swedish teenager skipped school for a climate protest, new waves of young people around the world have been making their voices heard on climate change. From school strikes to mass marches, the generation that will be inheriting our planet is calling for change and for a seat at the table. I'm Nasman, and this is Future Earth. Welcome to the new series shining a light on the simple, real-world solutions we already have to help us solve the biggest challenge of our lifetimes. Each week, we'll be taking you on a journey from our forests to the oceans, examining where we live, how we travel, and what we eat. We'll show you some of the paths for tackling the climate crisis, meeting the innovators, action takers, and climate heroes who are truly making a difference. Coming up this week, rewriting the textbooks. We visit students in the first U.S. state requiring climate change in its classrooms. We look at the rise of eco-anxiety among young people and the strategies for dealing with fears about the climate crisis. From protester to agenda setter, we'll introduce you to America's youngest White House climate advisor, plus a groundbreaking legal battle in Montana. Young people who sued to protect the environment in their own home state. We start this week with a little trip back to the classroom.
Everybody should be pulling up their presentation on one computer.
Today's lesson in Ms. Gruder's science class is something not every student in the U.S. is taught.
As the Earth's oceans absorb heat due to climate change, seawater expands, leading to an increase in sea levels.
How might those emissions from factories have an effect on climate? What are they actually releasing?
This is an AP science class here at Science Park, and today the students have brought in their own group presentations. They're teaching each other about a climate change problem and solution. What's your presentation?
Our presentation is about the carbon emissions of extreme weather events.
While these students study climate change, much of the nation could be learning from them. Today's class is part of a unique program, preparing the next generation for our warming planet. This is Science Park High School in Newark, New Jersey, where around 1,000 students and their teachers are helping lead the way in climate change education. In 2020, New Jersey became the first state in the country to require that climate change be taught to all students from kindergarten to 12th grade.
We follow a curriculum, so it begins with a driving question, like how do CO2 emissions affect all biodiversity? The state's education standards are designed to teach young people about the natural world around them, why it's changing, and what they can do about it.
We actually got to calculate our own carbon footprint, and I thought it was actually such an amazing experience.
I learned a lot in the classroom, scenarios outside the classroom, but I think one of the biggest focuses is, okay, this is what we're doing, and because of this is happening. It's like a cause and effect type of lesson.
And instead of focusing on doom and gloom, teachers emphasize proactive lessons.
I don't think they come away from it anxious. I think because we touch on solutions and solutions on an individual basis and on a wider basis. But once they actually learn about the science behind it and what can be done actually to reduce the impacts, then I think they feel a lot more confident about it.
Climate change is not an abstract lesson in the Garden State. From Superstorm Sandy and Hurricane Ida to the Canadian wildfire smoke that covered parts of the East Coast in 2023. These students have already experienced climate-fueled disasters firsthand. In New Jersey, climate change education isn't just for science class. It's being integrated into just about every classroom and every subject across the state. And that includes art.
Yeah, we got a giant killer whale here that's been covered with plastic.
Ms. Bruin's students have been building large-scale installations using recycled and reclaimed materials like plastic bottles.
They wanted to show the ill effects that these bottles were causing to the environment. They believe that the environment is probably one of their biggest challenges in their lifetime, and they want the public to be aware that something needs to be done.
The program is already helping students learn climate lessons inside the classroom and out.
I have had students come away from my class making real changes in their lives because of what they learned about in class. I've had students like change their diets, become vegetarians, eat less meat, change their like transportation habits and things like that because of what they learn in the class. It definitely makes an impact on them.
In 2023, Connecticut became the second U.S. state to mandate a climate curriculum. This school, here in New Jersey, hopes more will follow its lead.
It makes me proud that we took on this idea, and not only this idea, but this concept, to learn about it, implement it in classrooms, because once again, it's part of our daily lives. We have to be informed. I think being informed allows our brains to want to make a change, gives us a drive to want to make a change, because when you know something, you want to change it, especially in the case that you feel it's not as good for you.
I would love other districts or states to see what's happening here and find ways that they too can integrate these topics across their disciplines.
What would you tell other districts or other states if they came up and asked you, hey, we want to do this too? What would you tell them?
I would say, come on over and we'll show you how it's done right.
So clearly, young people are engaged. In fact, 81% of Generation Z in the U.S. says that climate change is either somewhat or very important to them. That's compared to 74% for all Americans. And Gen Z ranks climate change as the top societal issue in the U.S. compared to 6th among all Americans. So instead of shying away, many young people are leaning in, often in some creative ways. Let's meet 3 of them now. Heidi Pan is a New Jersey high school student and the host of her own podcast called 1.5 Degrees. Zion Walker is a high school senior in Ohio and the founder of the Black Teen Mental Health Coalition. And Sage Palmetto is a scientist and artist linking sounds, music, and nature. And I got the chance to chat with all 3 of them. Heidi, I just want to start with you. Now, you are still in high school, but you already have your own podcast. It's called 1.5 Degrees. What kind of perspective do you think you can bring with your show that us adults aren't able to do?
The way I started this podcast is I realized that there wasn't many other perspectives of young people telling the stories of existing climate work from the perspective of a young person. But as an inspiring environmentalist, I wanted to learn more about this incredibly diverse and interdisciplinary field. So that's kind of the approach that I took with this podcast, to try and bridge those intergenerational and experiential gaps.
Sage, I want to turn over to you now. Your work as a scientist and as an artist really centers on the Earth and climate change. But those would sound at least like 2 very different fields. So how are you trying to bring the 2 of those together, science and music?
Well, I've been heavily inspired by philosophies from non-Western cultures. Western science doesn't necessarily touch on these felt feelings of energy moving through your body and the experience of taking in energies from your senses and how those signals get processed and interpreted. There's not always space to really digest that energetic exchange through sciences. And so that's what draws me to art.
Zion, I want to come over to you because you founded the Black Teen Mental Health Coalition at age 17. This is helping to address mental health issues in your community, specifically in the Black community. How are you working to support people of color in the face of so many issues, but specifically in terms of climate change and that kind of anxiety that comes along with the way that the planet's changing?
Eco-anxiety or eco-grief, it can affect anyone. So basically, it's just, seeing the world around you, seeing the natural disasters. And in the African-American community, there are disparities in terms of housing and location. And some of the natural disasters happen in those communities. So African-American teens can be disproportionately affected. My job or my goal is to provide them with the proper resources and just guidance too.
Heidi, how about you? Is that something you've touched on at all in terms of your podcast?
We need to remember and remind each other that we're not alone in this experience, that we're here to support each other. And the best way to go about environmental work has been to find support in community.
As much as the climate crisis is, can be really overwhelming, I think it's also an opportunity just for this generation to lead the way in really reestablishing those communal networks that are so vital.
You're also a musician, and actually we have a clip here of one of your songs, so let's just quickly take a listen. So you've actually said that, with your music, it's a lot about healing ourselves in order to heal the planet. What do you mean by that? Talk us through that and the role that music can play in that.
Every living organism on this planet is moving, is vibrating, and is communicating on a vibrational level. There's a lot that we can learn through communication, especially vibrational communication and the act of deep listening.
Now, Heidi, I just want to turn back to you. And in listening to some of your podcasts, it seems like one of the themes you come back to is solutions and climate change solutions. We actually have a clip of one of the solutions that you've been discussing on your show.
You highlighted a really amazing way to break down food waste, but now that you highlight, it's also there's kind of many more other incredible applications of the products that you make. So I guess, can you tell me a little bit more about the other ways that soldier fly frass can be used, and I guess the materials from fly frass?
Where we get our biomaterials from, okay, we don't extract it from the frass or the poo of the insect. We actually extract it from the cocoon shells. So in a normal black soldier fly farm, they want the larvae for animal feed and the frass for fertilizer. And the cocoon shells are a byproduct. They just throw it away.
Oh, I see.
So we found a way to repurpose that and make this circular industry, the black soldier fly industry, even more circular.
So why do you think it's important that climate journalism focuses on solutions?
First off, there's so many incredible solutions that are already existing and that are in development, and that they haven't been covered is tricky, because without that knowledge or understanding of the solutions that already exist, there's no way for funding to get to them and have them be implemented in the scale that we need now more than ever.
Zion, you've actually said that your main goal with your group is to give people hope. What does that hope look like? How do you go about that, especially when it comes to such difficult issues that we've been talking about?
To give people hope, we need to not just look at negative statistics, but positive ones. What have organizations been doing? What have governments been doing to combat climate change? I feel like that's very important. To also let everyone know that they're not alone in this feeling and your feelings aren't exaggerated at all. It's good to appreciate what we have.
So this generation is active, but it's also worried about the state of the planet now and in the future. It's called climate anxiety, the distress that many of us can feel about climate change and extreme weather events like what we've already been seeing, from the spread of wildfires like what we saw in Hawaii, or flash flooding like here in New York City. And when people talk about their own climate anxiety, they often say it's linked to the vast amounts of negative and often scary news about our Earth. So let's talk about how we can cope in a healthy way. For more, I caught up with Sarah Newman. She's the co-founder and executive director of the Climate Mental Health Network. You've said previously that climate change has created a global mental health crisis. What do these statistics say about how people are struggling to deal with the climate crisis?
A 2021 study in The Lancet of 10,000 youth worldwide in 10 countries found that 75% said the future is frightening because of the climate crisis, and 4 in 10 do not want to have children because of the climate crisis. And here in the United States, there was a study that came out that found that 68% of the Gen Zers that they surveyed across the United States said the climate crisis is impacting their mental health. And so I really think that it doesn't matter where you are living. All of the research shows that people across the globe are struggling with the mental health impacts.
You mentioned that you're speaking with young people about this. What do they tell you? What are they going through?
They'll talk to me about how their professional choices are focused on the climate crisis, and that doing anything aside from addressing the climate crisis is not important to them.
What steps can we take to combat this mental health crisis among kids when it comes to climate change? What should we be doing?
Having a range of climate emotions is a normal response to the climate crisis, and it's really, really important to acknowledge that and for people to not feel alone. And it's really important for people to be able to work across generations, to be able to support each other. Another thing that's really important is looking at understanding that taking climate action, everyone has a role to play. In terms of taking climate action, one thing that's important to note is that we're not looking for climate heroes. We're looking for everyday people who have the ability to take meaningful action in ways that are using their skills, their interests, and their resources to take action in their community to make a difference.
How do you keep your optimism, and what gives you hope about this next generation of people, about Gen Z?
Taking action in whatever way is meaningful to someone is so important to manage one's climate emotions. I started doing this work because I was struggling with my own climate emotions and looking for resources. And I realized I'm not alone. It's about each of us taking action. And for me, working on the mental health impacts of the climate crisis is my act of hope. This is my taking action. And what really inspires me every day to do this work are the people that I work with, many of whom are Gen Z.
As the generation that will inherit the climate we leave behind, young people increasingly want to help make decisions about what that climate will look like. For some, that's done through protests like the widespread Fridays for Future demonstrations that brought millions of students out of class and into the streets to demand action in the US and around the world, from Hamburg, Germany to Parliament Square in London. Now, the movement was sparked by one young activist in Sweden, Greta Thunberg. She's a global icon now, but let's flash back to 2018 when her movement was still getting going and a relatively unknown Greta took her now famous sign to the UN Climate Change Summit in Poland.
I just want to make a statement, and if they drag me away, then they will drag me away. I am most nervous about that if I'm not going to be able to stay here, if they're going to move me.
Now, many years later, Greta is no longer a teenager, and many in her movement are taking their activism directly to the halls of power. I caught up with one school striker who's now become the youngest ever White House advisor. Jerome Foster II is a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So, Jerome, you probably recognize this spot here in front of the White House where you were not so long ago on Fridays protesting for climate change action. Now, you're advising the people inside the White House. Talk to us about that journey a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I started climate striking in February of 2019, I had joined what I felt like was a group of 10 to 20 young people who were using a sign in really iconic locations like in Sweden, like in Washington, D.C., in New York City, to send a statement to elected officials that climate action has to happen now. And soon, weeks after, I had groups of young people, 400 young people that came all across Maryland, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and cities all across the East Coast.
What was your reaction when you became the youngest climate advisor to the White House, after standing outside the White House?
My reaction was that when I had got an email from the White House that I was going to be a part of the Environmental Justice Advisory Council, was that I didn't think that it was gonna be like such a massive statement from them that would actually make a lot of action. At first I was like, oh, this might just be a council where they slap people's names on there and then they might actually do anything. But it was, after 3 years of now being a White House advisor, we've seen a myriad of our recommendations be implemented into policy actions.
We saw this big wave of climate protests with youth out in the streets, especially in 2019.
led by you, led by Greta Thunberg. What do you think those protests ended up changing?
I think a lot of the climate protests, what they changed was beyond politics, was the culture around the climate crisis and understanding that it is a very much deeper issue than just science and technology around slapping a solar panel on the climate crisis and saying, oh, this is the end of it, we can call the solution solved. The climate protests shed a light on that and said, hey, let's think about how environmental justice is an opportunity for us to reinvest in communities. I think one of the bigger things that we did is that we showed the world that young people should be a part of the conversation and that young people have a very critical role in a sense because we don't have an agenda for money or agenda for power. We have an agenda for the fact that our future is already been written in a script where it's now why so many young people have been able to change the conversations because we said, hey, invite us to the conversation, allow us to be a part of it.
How does your age, do you think, either help you or hurt you when it comes to trying to get your message across to the government?
I think that my age doesn't really impact it in a sense because like I feel like especially like online now, like everyone has the ability to have access to knowledge. But I think when I first got in the room, a lot of people that are part of the council have PhDs or are from community organizations in which they have been fighting for 50 years. So they know ground truth data. And I feel like from young people, a lot of our knowledge comes from where do we think long term and how do we think systemically. And I think a lot of what has changed now is that young people are taken seriously. But when I first joined, it was an energy of like, what are you doing here? Like, but now we've seen a lot of change in that is that I've been able to think about how do we make sure that a lot of the infrastructure that we're building lasts much longer than the lifespans they're thinking around like 10 to 20 years, but 70 years. I think that's going to change a lot more is that young people will be taken much more seriously because we're continuing to be out in the streets while also being in every other space.
Do you think if we put young people at the center of a climate change conference that things would go a bit quicker?
Yeah, young people have been the leaders of change for the past century. We've always been the leaders of change. And I think if we were at the decision-making tables, if we were in COP and they were truly listening to our demands, we'd have Fort Line communities having the financial that they need to be able to be insulated from the climate crisis. A lot of the communities that are being impacted first and worst by the climate crisis did nothing to contribute to it. So young people purely understand that. And if we're in those spaces, that change would have happened already.
All right, to the U.S. state of Montana now, where young people took their climate fight to the courts. 16 of the state's youngest citizens from age 5 to 22 accused Montana of violating their right to a clean and healthy environment and claimed that their generation would bear a greater burden than the adults doing the damage. The judge sided with the group of young claimants, finding that the state's approval process for fossil fuel permits was unconstitutional. The BBC's Sophie Long spoke to one of the claimants ahead of the trial verdict.
The feel of being out here and feeling the sun on your back and being able to breathe in the air and like see these landscapes. Like you know the place, and I guess just like being in this place in the world is just like the most wonderful thing.
So do you swim?
Yeah. Yeah, all the time. They're the Springs calves. I feel scared sometimes, kind of when it all sinks in, but also what I want to do is just take the steps that we need to, and like for me, being able to testify and be a part of this case is one of those steps that I feel is in the right direction for positive change and moving forward, because I know that we have to change and I'm hopeful for the future.
We end this week where we started, in the classroom, and what happens when you literally can't find the words to describe what's happening to our planet. As science has progressed, sign language hasn't always been able to keep up with the new terms like the greenhouse gas effect or carbon footprint. But now more than 200 new signs have been added to the British Sign Language Dictionary to ensure that everyone can be part of the conversation. Here's our science correspondent, Victoria Gill.
This is a lesson taught in British Sign Language, a language that until recently was missing crucial scientific vocabulary. At this secondary school in Glasgow, deaf children are learning newly created signs that have just been added to the BSL dictionary.
So this is the sign for greenhouse gases, and that's a new one. I didn't know that one before.
Deaf scientists, educators and sign language experts work together to create the new signs. The scientist leading this project wants to break down the language barriers that she faced in her early career.
I was involved in research for 11 years.
and although I went to numerous meetings but was never truly involved because I couldn't understand what people were saying, the interpreters weren't qualified.
In the last decade, dozens of descriptive scientific signs have been added to the official British Sign Language glossary. It's language that's helping some of the next generation of scientists to understand and talk about the world around them.
From podcasts to protests or even taking legal action, young people everywhere are working to protect our planet and cut down on pollution. And before we go, a quick reminder, if you want to get more from Future Earth delivered each week directly to your inbox, sign up for the Future Earth newsletter. In it, you'll find behind-the-scenes reporting from me, the week's top climate stories, and insights from our entire BBC climate change team. I'm Nasman. Thanks for watching Future Earth.